Hello, welcome to the next in our series of Trusting in God, looking at the life of Moses. So we have made it to the final plague. Can you believe it? So today's verses are Exodus 11, and you want to read all of chapter 11 and then chapter 12 up to the end of verse 30. And have a read, grab a cuppa, something like that. And just have a read of that before we go any further. So we get to this final plague, the plague of the death of the firstborn. Not nice at all. But before that happens, before the plague actually happens, we see God taking the Israelites through Moses and Aaron through various things that they need to do to prepare themselves for what's to come, and also things that's going to spare them from this final awful plague. First thing that God asks the Israelites to do is to go to their neighbours asking them for items of silver and gold. And then we get this bit in brackets afterwards that tells us this little aside that during the time that's gone on over the plagues, the Egyptian people and Pharaoh's officials have basically come to look on the Israelites and Moses with some favour and high regard. And it tells us there that it's God who's made this happen. So in the midst of Pharaoh's anger and power struggle, all of the other people in Egypt have basically turned to look on the Israelites in a different way. Why has God asked the Israelites to go to their neighbours, to go to the Egyptians, to ask them for these things? We can see that from what that tells us that probably they will answer them in a nice way, or perhaps think what can they pass on to the people as they approach their neighbours and ask them for this. But why has God asked them to do this? And it's really quite a simple reason, that the Israelites are slaves. The Israelites have nothing, and by asking their neighbours for these items, they would have probably got things like jewellery or small items. On asking for it, it would have provided them with some wealth, some possessions that they can take with them when they leave Egypt. As they were slaves, other than perhaps some clothes they were wearing, some basic livestock that they might own, the Israelites would have had nothing. And they had been treated as slaves and seen in that way for so long. They would have had no wealth, nothing to take with them. And these items that hopefully the Israelites can gain from the Egyptians would have presented them with some wealth, with some money, or kind of bargaining things, or things they could sell so they can make it on their own. God is already thinking at this point of what is ahead, what they will need to make it in freedom, to make it once they leave Egypt, once they leave this place of slavery. But before we come to the other things that God takes the Israelites through and asks Moses and Aaron to speak to the Israelites about in terms of what they need to do at this point, let's just have a look and see where Pharaoh's at where we are in the journey now. So we read last week that Pharaoh had told Moses never to come into his presence again. And we can see here that Moses does, and it even describes it as Moses is hot with anger. And so Moses speaks to Pharaoh and he tells him what this final plague is going to be, what the final thing is going to be that will make Pharaoh let the people go. And Moses doesn't seem to wait for a response. He's obviously that angry, and maybe, dare I say it, a little fearful for his life, because as we read last week, not only did Pharaoh say never come into my presence again, but basically said next time I see you I'm going to kill you. So I'm sure Moses probably didn't want to stick around for long. But we're told that even with this news of death and destruction, this final plague, that Pharaoh's heart is still hard and he still won't let the people go, even with that threat of death that Moses tells him is also going to be felt by his very own family. So let's pause again here. There is so much in these verses. We could spend probably another week unpacking what's going on here and all the different things that God is saying to the people. So we see that this death of the firstborn, the plague of the firstborn in that way, isn't just about the people, but it's also about the livestock. They are included in this plague. And we see in other bits that we've read in today's verses that God gives the Israelites instructions over what to do in terms of preparing meat and preparing the unleavened bread. And so we see in the detail God gives on that the firstborn among animals, those young, those like with the lambs, it's the 1-year-old lambs. There's something important about these animals. The Israelites were to sacrifice a very specific lamb from the goats or the sheep, and the animal that they are being asked to sacrifice is something that would have been very special, very costly, and worth a lot to them. For them to be using that animal as a sacrifice would mean they'd be losing out potentially on income and different things like that. But the same with the firstborn of the livestock. By them being killed in this plague, it would have been very costly to the Egyptians as well. And God is making this big statement here. And he even says it to Moses and Aaron, that this is such a momentous time, such a momentous thing, not only the death of those firstborn people, but also the impact of this, of the livestock, and of creating this special meal of unleavened bread and meat. This is big. This is going to be an event. This is going to be something that is going to be remembered and commemorated for the rest of the time of Israel. So God is making a statement here, but he's also doing something not only on the people side, but on the animal side that is going to be really costly. But again, we're going to pause again and remember something ourselves, which is what God's promise was back in Exodus 4 to Moses. And in verses 21 to 23 of Exodus 4, God unpacks with Moses that Israel is his firstborn. And if Pharaoh won't let his firstborn go, then God is going to kill Pharaoh's firstborn. That promise was made to Moses before any of the plagues were even mentioned, before Moses had even approached Pharaoh on letting the people go. And it's hard, isn't it? This plague is hard for us to get our heads around, the idea of God killing so many people and animals, and that being the way for his people to be set free. But God wanted to make a statement here. He wanted to show that his people are special, are loved. But there's another side to all of this as well. All of this is a foreshadow of the death that is still to come at this point. God's son, God's firstborn son, being sacrificed like a lamb, his blood shed, his body broken, the costliest sacrifice ever, also that we might live. The final bit of preparation God asks the Israelites to do after they've put the blood of the lamb around their door frames as that kind of protective act, that sign of we are God's people, is God tells them about the clothes to wear whilst they're about to eat this food of meat and unleavened bread. And it's interesting because the clothes God asks them to wear are travel clothes. God is preparing them to be ready to leave. God knows, God's already said to Moses that this is it. This is the final plague. As soon as the death comes, as soon as this happens, Pharaoh is going to let the people go. And God wants his people to be able to leave slavery, leave Egypt, leave Pharaoh's rule and power as soon as they possibly can. So get your travel clothes on, because you need to be ready, because we are leaving, is what God is saying to them. And one final point for us to think on is this of the unleavened bread, which he's talked on a lot, both for them to eat at that meal, but also to eat in subsequent festivals as a commemoration of what has happened here, as a reminder of God's power and God's grace and love for his people. Leaven is a symbol, is a metaphor for sin. So God is telling the people that in this festival every year, to help you remember what God has done, to help you remember who he is, have this unleavened bread. Because not only is it a reminder in terms of God was there with you in the planning and getting you ready to go, but by eating the bread without the leaven, which is the yeast, which is that symbol of sin, it's that reminder, it's that truth, it's bringing the people back to remember that everyone needs that leaven, that sin, that yeast removing from their lives. It needs completely removing, and the only person that can do that is God, by delivering us into freedom through the sacrifice that we live in, that truth, the sacrifice of Jesus for us. There are so many points in these verses that point us towards God's power, but also God's faithfulness for us. So much in this pointing us towards the sacrifice that at this point was still to come of Jesus. So I want to encourage us as we go through these difficult verses and get our heads around what God is doing here, is to remember what God has done in our lives, the sacrifice of Jesus, God's firstborn and only Son for us, so that that sin could be removed from our lives. And let's remember and be so thankful and grateful to the wonderful, faithful God we have. God bless.